All right, it's time for Unit 4, Lecture 2. In Lecture 1, we talked about how we as people, humans, use land. In Lecture 2, we're going to focus on urban land use of the city, or of the highly populated areas compared to the more open, less populated areas of the rural land that we talked about a little bit in the last unit. Urbanization is what causes urban areas to form, and urbanization is the increase in the number of people living in the areas. Alright, so it's an increase in the number of people living in an urban area rather than a rural area, so more people living in a city than a country. The reason people go to cities is there are more jobs and better paying jobs in the cities and in towns than there are out in the countryside or the rural areas. And what we've seen is in the early 1900s, late early 1900s, there was a lot of urbanization here in the U.S. and the rest of the developing world, but for the last 50 years or so, we've seen a little bit of a slowdown in urbanization as we've got larger and larger areas. And so you had a bunch of smaller towns and medium-sized cities start growing, and then they grew big enough that they ended up with suburbs, and eventually those suburbs would connect each other, and you'd get these large areas of cities grown together called metropolitan areas. One such area was Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Here we can see almost 70 years worth of growth. Here's Washington, D.C. down here. Right there. Here's Baltimore in 1925. As both of these cities started growing throughout the early 20th centuries, they started expanding out. And as of 1992, I could not find a more recent picture showing this, but it's actually the red area in between has gotten bigger. As the population kept growing, Washington, D.C.'s area got bigger, Baltimore's suburb area got bigger, and now they're starting to connect each other. And a lot of times you'll hear this whole area of the country as the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area. They share an airport. BWI is Baltimore Washington Airport. There's another airport, Dulles, in Washington, but they share one airport or a couple of airports. There's one named after the two of them. And they're pretty close to each other. And they've grown into this major metropolitan area because the two cities' populations grew so much that they have almost connected. So sometimes urban areas grow really fast, and other times they grow slow. And when they grow slow, they tend to be relatively nice places, pleasant places to live. And because as the city grows, the town can grow with it. So slow growth of a city allows for that city to kind of grow with the slowly increasing population. Whereas if you have a massive increase in population, a big population spike, a big flood to a city, you could sometimes end up with problems. So the big thing in these slow cities, we have buildings, roads, and parking lots get mixed with green spaces, which are areas with lots of plants and grass. And what these green spaces do, these green spaces provide ecosystem services. So they help moderate the temperature, they help filter rainwater and runoff, and they provide a nice, pretty place to go look and relax at times. If our population grows too fast instead of nice and slow, we have something called the urban crisis. The urban crisis is a phrase that is used to describe a rapid increase in urban growth, rapid urbanization. And what happens is the infrastructure of the city starts to break down. And the infrastructure includes stuff like roads, bridges, sewers, railroads. All right, the basic facilities that help people get along and get to where they need to go. And if you have this urban crisis, and remember this urban crisis, this is from Rapid Urbanization. A rapid growth in the city. You could end up with stuff such as major traffic jams, substandard housing, polluted air and water. So really bad stuff. And this term, urban crisis, was the term that they came up with to describe this. And if you look at here, this is Hong Kong. You have beautiful downtown area of Hong Kong right there. But it's grown so quick and so fast, and people are still moving there, that they're starting to build houses on these hillsides, which is not the best place to build a house, on the side of a hill. Especially when you're packing them in real close like this, it can lead to other problems. So as we see an urban crisis start, or any city start to grow, we end up with another big ecological term here called the urban sprawl. And that's the spread of the city into the adjoining suburbs, or more importantly, into the rural areas. All right, and again, we have another good picture here in these pictures. Some of them, this one came right out of your textbook. Here we have farmland. This is a rural area. Here we have a suburban development outside of some city. And now there's only a couple blocks of forest separating the farm from the suburb. And what's happening here is this suburb is moving outward and taking up some of those rural areas. So what we see happening is the suburbs are growing and expanding out and taking up farmland, and they're taking up about 1 million hectares of land per year. So this is land that we used to use to make food, we're now using to house people. And so we house more people in areas with lots of food in it, or in areas that we used to use to make food. And food is obviously important for people to live, so we're reducing our ability to make food to increase our ability to house people. And, you know, shelter is another really important thing we need too, so it's a balancing act. In order to alleviate some of the problems from the farmland, we start building houses or building cities where there's little room for growth. And so we start finding these weird land areas, or land that is poorly suited for building, and we call this marginal land. All right, it's marginal at best. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. All right, we definitely can use that here. Here we have a couple houses, and you can see them right on the ocean's edge. This is in California, probably outside of LA or San Francisco or Oakland, one of the big cities there. And because of shoreline erosion, building a house right next to the ocean is not a great idea. And, you know, it provides beautiful sights, but these houses are expensive to build because there's not a whole lot of support there. If you get a big enough storm, where the storm surge rises up this high, it could wipe out the house easily. And so because of that, repair and insurance costs are very expensive. But you do get a nice view. Other problems that have arisen from urbanization are environmental conditions. All right, and this should hopefully make sense to you. If you've ever gone walking outside on a hot summer day, even here in the Rochester area, which, while we are classified as an urban area, we are nowhere near what we would consider a big city, especially when you think of the likes of Baltimore and Washington and New York City and LA and Houston and Seattle and Boston, all those places. All right, so we're not a lot like that, but we do see some of this. And if you've ever gone outside on that hot, bright, summer, sunny day, and you've gone out barefoot, you walk through the grass and it's nice and cool, and you walk into the street, you burn your feet almost. And that's because the blacktop, the pavement there, will generate and trap more heat. And so what we see going on, if we know what the temperature is in the late afternoon, which is the hottest part of the day, because the sun's already been out for a long time, and now the earth is starting to re-radiate some of the heat it absorbed earlier, rural areas and suburban areas, the temperature stays about the same, and it should be the same temperature over the whole area. Well, as you approach the city and get to downtown where all the buildings and streets are, and there are no green things, maybe a few trees, but very few parks, not a whole lot of large green areas like you might get in the suburbs with lawns, the temperature can jump up almost 10 degrees. I mean, 85, 92 is 7 by the math I was taught. So, 7-degree jump, and that's all because of what's underneath the sun, what's on the ground. We got buildings and dark rooftops and pavement, all stuff that absorbs heat and re-radiates it. Whereas when you're out in the rural farmland areas, it's a greener color and everything, and that just, it doesn't, the vegetation itself absorbs some of the energy from the light and converts it through photosynthesis. So one of the things is we get this heat island effect, which is an area where the air temperature is higher than the temperature of the surrounding rural areas. All right, and it's created by that infrastructure, which is those roads and the buildings that make the city run. They absorb and retain heat longer than the vegetation would out in the rural area. Because of this increase in heat, we start seeing effects of local weather patterns. And so we have hot air rising over a city. All right, hot air rises. All right, you've seen this in the bathroom when you've taken a shower. The hot air goes up, it starts to cool, and as hot air cools, any moisture in it starts to condense and can produce rain clouds. All right, in Atlanta, Georgia, one of these major metropolitan areas, we've seen an increase in rainfall as a side effect to the heat island. So, heat island, the heat island effect, will increase rainfall on one side of the city because it's caused air to rise. One of the things we can do, we can plant trees or install eco rooftops or rooftops. So you can see over here, a normal rooftop, dark in color, absorbs and radiates a lot of heat. Where this green rooftop here, there's some light colors on there that don't absorb so much heat, and then we got some parkland up there, and all of that allows some of that heat to be reflected or not to be absorbed and radiated off throughout the day, and the parkland allows it to be used in good ways, and that helps moderate the heat island effect. It's not perfect, but it does help reduce the effects of it a little bit. So now that we've learned all this stuff over the last 50 years or so, we started doing things called land use planning or urban planning. And that's just planning the use of the land. All right? So planning how we're going to use the land. And it's what we are now requiring here in the U.S. In order to look at the environmental impact of any new buildings, and we allow the public to comment on it as well. And so in order to get anything done or a new area to be developed, you need this urban plan, this land use planning that tells the public and the government officials and any businesses and everybody what is going to happen and what kind of impact this is going to have. The downside of the urban planning is that the developers, governments, businesses, and the residents and citizens will a lot of times disagree on how the land should be used. All right, the governments probably want more tax revenue. The local businesses want to pay less taxes but have more space for their businesses to be able to do what they want. The citizens don't want to pay for it with their tax dollars. The developers want to build it because that's how they make money. So each group has its own interests, and they all have to come to some kind of compromise to make this happen, and that's why they disagree a lot. One of the largest steps forward we've had with the whole technological revolution of the late 80s and 90s and into today in technology are programs such as the Geographical Information System, or GIS systems, which are ways of manipulating and viewing geographical data. So ways of looking at an area at different levels. And really what they do is they take the real world, and then they go in and they slice out different parts of it. All right, they can figure out where just the people are and make a map of just where people are located, or just the streets. Or you get a map of how the land is used, where's land used for urban and rural and commercial areas and residential areas and industrial areas. And so they look at many different slices of the land to help them plan with the land use planning. So land use planning works a lot better and almost needs the GIS systems to help store and look at all these different land areas. So it allows, again, more with this GIS system, because it is such an important tool for urban development. It allows a user, or it allows the developer or the city council or whoever is working on the land use plan to look at different types of data. So they can find out where all the sewer lines are. Are we going to mess with the sewer lines or the power lines? Do we have roads established, or we need to build new infrastructure, new roads to get to these places? Are there parks there? All right, and they can create maps of all this stuff, and we can display these different layers. A lot like using an old overhead transparency here in school, where you just put a new page on top of an old page to develop a whole picture. The other big thing we have to worry about in cities, especially here in the U.S., is that a lot of our cities, unless you're way downtown, are very difficult to get around without a car, especially if you're going from one place to another. I mean, think of Rochester. Yeah, if you're downtown, you can get from Blue Cross Arena to Dinosaur Barbecue to Frontier Field, even to the Eastman School of Music and the Museum of Play by walking, you know. But if you're trying to get from McQuaid to those places, and McQuaid's mailing address is technically in Rochester and not Brighton, it's not as easy to get there without taking some kind of transportation, either a bus or a car. And one of the reasons for this is a lot of the cities in the U.S. were constructed after the invention of the automobile, or very close to after the invention, or even after a lot of people were using horse-drawn carts. A lot of these cities were constructed way after we've domesticated horses, and we had a way to transport 4 or 5 people at once, so you could spread things out a little more, and you need to make the roads a little bigger. Also in the U.S., as our cities spread out, we have had the advantage of being able to spread out over land. We had the land available. All right, land was not a limiting issue. We have a fairly large country, and if you think of our country west of the Mississippi River, there's a lot of wide open area. Look at cities like Dallas and like Oklahoma City and Phoenix, Arizona, Houston. These cities that are even something like St. Louis, these cities are out in the middle of countrysides. All right, they can grow a large amount before running into a different space occupied by a city. So because of all this, we can build our cities a little bit larger. In Europe, a lot of European cities were built before before they needed really wide roads for cars or carts and buggies. It might have been people on horseback or even walking from town to town. So if we take a look, and I went and I looked up a couple cities that are about the same size. Athens, Greece is a little bit larger than St. Louis. But one of the things you can see is the nice wide streets of St. Louis. All right, right there, there's the arch. There's where the Cardinals play. I think this right over here is St. Louis University. And so you can see the big wide streets, whereas if we look at a picture of Athens, and here's some of downtown Athens, you can't really see the streets because they're a lot narrower. That's why Europeans always, when you see movies and pictures and stuff in some of their cities, you see a lot of really tiny cars. Stuff like Mr. Verasso's Yaris is a very popular car over there, all right? It's not that big, and it can get around and get through places quickly. All right, you see a lot of Vespa scooters and even motorbikes over in Europe compared to in the U.S. And you see some of that in cities like New York and Boston, where having a small car with a lot of maneuverability is good. But look around here. A lot of people drive SUVs and trucks. They're not as big and popular over in Europe because there's just not the space for them to move around the city like there is here in the U.S. In order to help alleviate this need for a car and to get people to go where they wanted to go, we came up with mass transit systems. All right? And those are buses, trains, subways, anything to move many people at one time. And we have a decent bus system here in Rochester. The RTS takes you to where you need to go. If you know the bus routes, you know how to get on and off the bus and where they all go. This picture here, this is the mass transit system of Boston, I believe. And you got the different subway routes going on there, the red line, the orange line, the green line, and a blue line. All right, and this gray line. And they take you to different areas, and it's a much more effective way to get around a city like Boston than driving from place to place. All right, I was in Boston this summer with my family. I paid $45 a night for my car just to park it somewhere. And if we wanted to drive from place to place, I would have probably had to pay $20 to $30 per place I went to park, where we could hop on the subway as many times as we wanted for that week for like $40 for all 4 of us. And so the mass transit system did what it needed to do. All right? It limited the amount of land needed for parking lots, reduced highway and congestion. All right, I was one less person driving around the city. City would be less congested, reduces air pollution because my car's not sitting and running at the stoplights, and I'm on these large subways or buses with hundreds of other people. All right? In some areas, you can't necessarily build some of the mass transit systems on subways. Out in California, there's not a whole lot of space underground, so they don't have a lot of subways, and carpooling has become a big option. And there's high occupancy vehicle lanes, HOV lanes on the thruway, where you need to have 3 or 4 people in your car to be able to drive in that lane, or it's a huge ticket and fine. There are services out there in some big cities or in suburbs of big cities of people going into the city to go to work, but they live, maybe an hour outside. 4 strangers meet at a place, 3 of them park their cars, get in, one of the random people's car. They don't know anybody. It's different people every day. And they have rules like they can't use their cell phones and they're not allowed to talk while they're in the car. And that's how they get from place to place, but it's a cheaper alternative than driving yourself in and paying every day. So carpooling does help alleviate some of these problems as well. But a lot of our mass transit systems, or a lot of our cities have these mass transit systems to kind of help out with the problem of getting people from one place to another, or getting people to where they want to go. The other big thing that is important for big cities to have is open space. Areas for scenic and recreational enjoyment. Not everybody wants to go and look at buildings every day. And so we also get environmental benefits from these green areas. All right. And we include parks. Think of Central Park in New York, public gardens, bicycle and hiking trails, if that's available, if you can have that there. Here's another picture of Boston, and there is a big area right through the middle of the city called the Greenway. It was where Interstate 90 went through. We can call these areas green belts, and they provide those ecological services. The final thing that these open spaces do, and some of the service they provide, is they pull out carbon dioxide and make oxygen for people. They take pollutants from the air and water. They keep a city cooler in the summer. If there's enough of the green spaces, it doesn't really work so well. In this case, this is Central Park in New York City. You can see all the urban area around it. Again, this is pretty high up, but you can even make out some of the big wide streets in even a place like New York City, which is an older city for us. And so there are a lot of pluses to the open spaces. All right, plus it gives people a place to exercise and relax, and people need to be able to relax, especially if they live in a city. So that's it for this unit, or this unit's lecture. We got one more lecture in the unit, and we'll look at conserving land spaces. Now that we've looked at how we've used it to make cities and how we're kind of eating it up a little bit, we'll talk about ways to conserve the land and make it better. If you have any questions, please bring them to class. And other than that, have a good night.